for bill introductions this morning, so we'll go ahead with and open the hearing on Senate Bill 277. Today's going to be interesting, committee. I'm sure people thought with 3 hearings, oh my gosh, how are we going to get through it? But I think I should have scheduled 2 more bills for today when you see how many proponents and opponents. So, Amelia, thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Senate Bill number 277 relates to individual income tax and would exempt certain qualified tips from state income tax beginning in tax year 2026. The bill would amend 7932-117 to provide a subtraction modification in the amount equal to the qualified tips received during the taxable year that are included on statements furnished to the employer pursuant to Internal Revenue Code Section 6053A, and that are included in the federal adjusted gross income of the taxpayer. The amount of the subtraction modification would be limited each year to $25,000 for each individual receiving qualified tips. There are definitions in the bill. A qualified tip means any cash tip received by an individual in the course of such individual's employment in an occupation that traditionally and customarily received tips on or before December 31st, 2024, as provided by the Secretary of Revenue, and the Secretary of Revenue would publish such a list of those occupations. Cash tips are also defined as including but not limited to tips received from customers, tips received from other employees under a tip sharing arrangement, and charge tips such as credit and debit card charges that the employer then distributes to the employee. A qualified tip, though, does not include any amount received by an individual in the course of employment by an employer if such individual had, for the preceding taxable year, compensation within the meaning of Internal Revenue Code Section 414Q4 from such employer in excess of the amount in effect under IRC Section 414Q1B1. And on the back of your memo today, I've also included the federal references that are referenced in this bill so that you can see what IRC Section 6053A provides regarding employees providing statements to their employer. Section 414Q4 essentially defines compensation as compensation of the participant from the employer for the year. And the threshold amount for the exclusion of qualified tips there, that's a definition in the Internal Revenue Code related to highly compensated employees. And it is adjusted annually based on a cost of living adjustment. And for tax year 2025, that particular amount was $160,000. I don't believe that the Internal Revenue Service has issued any the adjustment for 2026 yet, because that's too far in the future. And the bill would take effect from and after publication in the statute book, and I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Amelia. Committee, I do have a few questions. There's not a fiscal note with this, but Eddie, we did have some information that's kind of an estimate. I don't know if we want to put that out there because it's going to be considerably lower than that.
I think we might have Kador's estimate. I'm trying to find it in my emails really quickly.
And while he's looking, Amelia, would you go over the limits again, just so the committee's aware of it?
Certainly, Madam Chair. For one thing, the qualified tips that we're talking about here are tips that would have been reported to the employer on a federal statement. In addition, these particular tips would have to be included in the federal adjusted gross income as that comes forward onto the Kansas return. So it would have had to have been on the federal return so that the subtraction modification would then remove it here for the state income tax purposes. There is also a limit per individual that it cannot exceed $25,000 per year. There would be some occupational limitations And then also there's a limitation for taxable income or compensation from the employer in the previous year, that if they were a highly compensated individual, they would not have qualified tips.
Okay, thank you. And it's 25,000 per person. Thank you. Eddie?
The Department of Revenue's estimated fiscal impact for this bill is $4 million in fiscal year 2026 and $13.2 million in the years thereafter.
Okay, and that was before we asked for the $25,000 limit, if I'm correct,
I believe that is for the bill as written.
as written? Okay, so that number doesn't add up then, because when we didn't have a $25,000 limit on it, those were the exact same numbers.
It might be the case that the limit is high enough that it didn't pull down the impact in their estimate.
Okay, interesting. Okay, thank you. Senator Schallenberger.
Chairman, so if the feds do this, then the adjusted gross that comes back to us would already have that elimination in it. Is that possibly the way that would work?
Madam Chair, yes, if the feds were to do this, it would, the consequence would be that to some degree there may not be qualified tips in someone's federal adjusted gross income. But if they did have, I could see a scenario possibly where if their qualified tips were more than, let's say the federal limit was $25,000, and that was subtracted from the federal adjusted gross income, but they still had additional qualified tips over that $25,000 that did come through on their federal adjusted gross income, there could be, an additional, there could be some that would still flow through.
Senator Schallenberger.
So does that mean they'd get to take them off twice if we had another 25,000?
They wouldn't, I wouldn't say they wouldn't be able to subtract the same amount twice. It would depend on what their total qualified tip amount was, and if it exceeded the federal amount, if the federal government had an exemption, let's say of 25,000, but their tips were 35,000, then 10,000 may still be taxable at the federal level. If this bill were in place, that 10,000 may qualify for a state income tax deduction.
So I get this clear. So let's use that scenario. The feds have eliminated the tax on tips, 25,000. I make 35,000. 25 is when my adjusted gross transfers down to my Kansas form, whatever it is. I still have tips I can take off. And is there something that describes in our form, would there be something that says only above 25,000? Or would I just say, well, I got 35, I'll just put 35 down here?
I think those would be questions. This particular bill does not address that specific situation. The date itself of this bill is 2026, so I think there may be some anticipation that if the federal government did implement some sort of deduction for this, that there would be some time for the legislature to possibly follow up with this to make the appropriate adjustments if they felt that the state subtraction modification needed to address the fact that the federal government also had one.
Thank you. It does become a timing issue since session ends in April this year. That's why the delay on the legislation was to see what the federal does. So Senator.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I heard you use the word occupational limitations in reference to 277. What would be the occupational limitations?
The bill provides that qualified tip includes in its definition that it has to be a cash tip received by the individual in the course of their employment in an occupation that traditionally and customarily received tips on or before December 31st, 2024. And that the Secretary of Revenue will establish and provide that list of occupations.
Okay. So I'll just use a personal example. My grandson and I have installed a lot of storm shelters. Frequently, the homeowner will tip him, give him a $50 bill or something, and not me. But that's not necessarily customary. So that would not be, how would that play out? And I don't mean to get into the weeds too much, Madam Chairman, but I just find it interesting that we're going to have definition on occupational limitations. But we can cover that another day, I guess.
No, Senator, it's a good question. And I go ahead, Amelia.
Madam Chair, yes, there are occupational limitations in this particular bill. There's also the limitation that it is a qualified tip that is reported to the employer on a statement required by the Internal Revenue Service. So there are actually several requirements that have to be met, and that $50 would have to be in the federal adjusted gross income of that person. So there are actually several requirements that have to be established before the subtraction modification would occur.
So the intent is that there could be people trying to game the system that you don't normally give tips to, and so that's why the restrictive language. But any other questions for Amelia? Senator Schallenberger.
Well, when I'm trying to game the system in my brain, I'm thinking of a bonus. At the end of the year, you give your staff an extra $500, and I think that is something that they could call a tip, maybe. Thank you.
That is correct. Something we should consider if we work this legislation. Thank you, Amelia. Committee, I know the Senate President, our scheduling was off, and I take full responsibility for that. We may come back to this hearing, suspend it so that he has an opportunity to speak to the legislation. But for now, we have an opponent, Nathan Kessler. Welcome.
This is not the most effective way to provide it. While a popular talking point in recent months, exempting tips from income is generally regarded as impractical tax policy because of the complexity and inequity that it would introduce into the tax code with little to no benefit for the targeted workers. Experts from the Tax Foundation, Brookings, and the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, three organizations that can often be found at odds, agree that an exemption for tipped income is a headache waiting to happen. Let's consider the facts. In Kansas, there are approximately 35,000 employees working in occupations that we would typically consider as having a significant portion of their income derived from tips. That is a mere 2.5% of total employment in the state. Furthermore, the median annual income across these occupations is less than $30,000 per year. So after deductions, credits, and exemptions, many of these workers have no tax liability anyway. Who then is this bill supposed to help? It simply adds unnecessary complexity to the state tax code that makes it harder for both taxpayers and tax collectors to navigate. That, unfortunately, is just the tip of the iceberg. By taxing the cook and not the server, you introduce a large inequity into the system that will be ripe for exploitation. If this legislation were to be passed, there would be a line of lobbyists around the State House ready to plead the case for their clients to be able to write some income off as tipped wages. And that is the headache waiting to happen. If the legislature desires to put money in the pockets of tipped workers, the most effective way would be to raise the minimum wage. Short of that, Kansas is better off letting this discussion take place at the federal level and then making a decision on conformity later. The last thing we should do is get out in front of the rest of the nation in implementing a solution in search of a problem. I will now stand for any questions.
Committee, any questions? Senator Corson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You alluded to it, but I'll take a little bit of a different tack on it and see kind of what you think about it. I think this is, I'm not actually opposed to this. I think this is something we should be looking at, but I think it's only a partial solution because it only addresses low-wage workers who are working in industries where tips are a significant amount of their compensation. I think what we need to add to this is an increase in the minimum wage. I have a bill that would do that. I think we should couple these together because otherwise, if we don't do that, I think we're really picking winners and losers among low-wage workers. We're saying, if you're this kind of a low-wage worker, you get this tax benefit, but if you're this kind of a low-wage worker, you don't. So I think if we raised the minimum wage and did this, I think we would be more broadly addressing the needs of all of our low-wage workers, which is really what I think that proponents of this are trying to get at. So wanted to just get your thoughts on that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for the question. I think that at the end of the day, even with the minimum wage increase, you're still exempting the tips, so you're still kind of picking winners and losers, as the cook would still be taxed while the server would not. I also think that the impact on consumer behavior would be something to consider as well. If you raise the minimum wage for tipped workers, they may derive a whole lot less of their income from tips. And so at the end of the day, you may still just be netting out to if this bill was left as is.
Any other questions? Eddie, would you review, thank you for your testimony.
Okay.
And I guess I'll go on to the next. There's written neutral, Adam Mills. Is there anybody else that would like to testify as a proponent? Anybody as an opponent? Neutral. I'm going to close the hearing on Senate Bill 277, but I will reopen the hearing at a later date when I can schedule with the Senate President. So my apologies, committee, but we will get that taken care of. So Eddie, would you go over and remind the committee of what we passed last year on income tax cuts and reductions? And so how much you actually have to be earning in the state of Kansas before you start paying income tax?
So before a taxpayer pays the income tax, their income has to exceed, in essence, the sum of their exemption allowance amount and their deductions. The lowest level that would be if they take the standard deduction, a single filer taking the standard deduction with only themselves in terms of exemption. That number is going to be right around 13,000. For a married couple with no dependents, that number is probably going to be close to 26,500, and then I think you would add $2,320 to that amount for each dependent, and so a family of four, it would be a little over 30,000, almost around 31,000 probably.
Before they start paying
Yeah.
income tax?
Yeah.
Yes. No, thank you. I just wanted that reminder because we did make major adjustments to the legislation last year to help low-income individuals. So thank you. Committee will open the hearing on Senate Bill 195.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Senate Bill number 195 would establish the Property Tax Task Force to study the property tax system in Kansas and develop recommendations and suggest improvements to law that would provide for a more efficient or cost-effective property taxing system, including but not limited to property valuations and tax levies on real property. The task force would make and submit a report to the legislature concerning any recommendations and suggestions on or before January 31st of 2026, and the provisions of this section would expire on that date. The task force would be able to meet at any time within the state on the call of the chairperson, and members attending authorized meetings would be paid amounts as provided in 7532-223A, subject to approval of the Legislative Coordinating Council. The task force would consist of 9 members, and the list of the members there are on the front side of the bill. The 9 members would be the chairperson of this committee, chairperson of the House Committee on Taxation, the ranking minority member of this committee, the ranking minority member of the House Committee on Taxation, 2 members to be appointed by the President of the Senate, who are members of the Senate, and one of which would serve as the chairperson. 1 member to be appointed by the minority leader of the Senate, who is a member of the Senate. 1 member appointed by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who is a member of the House. And 1 member appointed by the minority leader in the House, who is a member of the House. And I would be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Amelia. So what would be the difference between this and an interim committee? Or maybe, would that be, okay. Yeah, well, okay, Amelia, we don't have any questions for you, so thank you. And the sad thing, disappointingly, there's no conferees that showed up to testify in person, so I really don't think that they were serious about this legislation. It's quite disappointing. We have written testimony from several proponents. Committee, I'll draw your attention to it. No opponents, and then written testimony from Spencer Duncan as neutral. Is there anybody that would like to testify as a proponent? As an opponent? As neutral? I don't think that they were serious about this legislation, and I will say that when this governor was elected, I went to her first thing and asked for a blue ribbon study on tax. And I will ask Eddie to provide for this committee tomorrow that instead of doing a blue ribbon study, she formed a committee of her own appointments. And I would ask that he also provide the committee recommendations that she formed, because it was not a deep dive study as I have been asking for several years, and will continue to work on my own time and my own dime on property taxes and other issues. Senator Corson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I like this issue. I think we can, take up, if we want an amendment, kind of, what the makeup of it is. But I just think with our new compressed calendar, it's so hard for us as a committee to take a really deep dive into an issue as complex as this. So I think it would be meritorious to have some real experts take a deep dive and look at this issue of property taxes from A to Z and come back to us with some recommendations. I do think if you look at the written proponents, you've got a really diverse group of people who are all proponents who don't always agree ideologically on a lot of issues, but are all stepping up and saying, yeah, let's get some really smart people together and take a look at this. So I'd be open to changes of kind of how the committee would be constructed. But I think when you look at the proponents, you see that I think a broad coalition of folks do think it's a meritorious issue. And just again, given our compressed calendar, I know it's so hard for us to really spend the time we need on one particular issue. So this might give us some good ideas that we could move on. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. And I don't dispute the idea, because we have been forming a group across statewide. In fact, thankfully, I don't want to put Mr. Ken on the spot, but he was extremely helpful with us this year. We had experts from all aspects of property taxes. And that's the thing about this. This is just legislators again. We had buy-in from BOTA, from PVD, from taxpayers to experts in the industry, to tax lawyers, and we ran the gamut. We brainstormed, we started out, and you have seen a few pieces of legislation as a result of that, and you will see some more legislation. We just didn't have time with the compressed schedule this year. So this effort has actually been going on without legislation. So much appreciated, and understand, I agree, it does need to continue, because we do have some major, but I would say it needs to happen for all taxes, not just property tax, income, and sales. So committee, any other comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll close the hearing on Senate Bill 195, and we'll open the hearing on 179.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Senate Bill number 179 relates to income tax and would establish a refundable child tax credit for resident individuals beginning with tax year 2025. for each qualifying child of the taxpayer in an amount based upon the Kansas adjusted gross income on the return. You'll see in the first page of the bill, as well as my memorandum, a chart that shows the corresponding amounts of Kansas adjusted gross income to the amount of the credit per qualifying child. For tax years after 2025, the threshold income amounts in the chart, as well as the credit amounts, would be increased by a cost of living adjustment. An individual may be claimed as a qualifying child by only one taxpayer each year, except that for married individuals who file separate returns, if they could have filed a joint return, they each may claim half of the credit amount that would have been claimed on a joint return. The bill also includes a definition of qualifying child that includes certain relationship, place of abode, age, and support requirements. And I think what is probably the most important for you to note is that qualifying child means a child under the age of 6, and that's by the end of the tax year. So they have to be essentially 0 through 5 years of age. And the bill would take effect from and after publication in the statute book, and I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Amelia. Committee, any questions? Seeing none, Senator Clubb.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just curious, so we have over 200,000 but not to exceed 350,000. We have a $50 tax credit and over 350,000 at 25. Do we need those credits on those levels of income?
I think that's
So that would be a question for the conferees. A good question, but a question for the conferees.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you. Any for Amelia? Thank you, Amelia. Committee, our first conferee is Nathan Kessler. Welcome back.
It's good to be back. All right, well, since the light's on this time, I'll go ahead and do the whole intro again. Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Nathan Kessler, and on behalf of Kansas Action for Children, I rise in strong support of Senate Bill 179. As the legislature looks for ways to provide meaningful tax relief, we believe that this is one of the best options under consideration. A child tax credit is among the most effective tools for lifting children out of poverty, and with the high cost of food and other necessities, it should be a top priority for the Kansas legislature. This one policy can simultaneously feed hungry children, stimulate economic activity, and better align our tax code with the interests of the working class and our state's family values. The proof, as they say, is in the pudding, which probably sounds pretty good to the kids this would benefit. So let's look at the facts. In 2021, the federal CTC alone was responsible for lifting 2.9 million children out of poverty. It should come as no surprise then that in recent years, 16 states have adopted a CTC of their own. 3 of these states, Colorado, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, are in our own backyard. Further underscoring the need for the state to implement its own child tax credit is the substantial jump in the number of food-insecure children after the expiration of the federal CTC expansion. From 2021 to 2022, Kansas saw a 6 percentage point increase in children experiencing food insecurity. The result is that nearly 1 in 5 children in this state don't know where their next meal will come from. This should be unacceptable, and with a bipartisan bill that could single-handedly improve the situation, we don't have to accept it. For many cost-burdened parents, providing adequate nutrition may not be the problem. Different families have different needs, and the greatest strength of a refundable CTC is that it gives parents the freedom to make those decisions. Evidence shows that expanded federal CTC payments were used for essential items and groceries, so rest assured the money is going to a good cause. Allowing parents the flexibility to determine what is best for their children will also yield the best return on the state's investment. As written, we estimate that this CTC can generate approximately $3 in economic activity for every $1 returned to taxpayers. Because the people most impacted by this policy are those in the lower and middle income brackets who have a higher propensity to consume, the tax relief provided to these families will be spent in communities across the state, supporting jobs and local businesses while improving the lives of the children in those communities. A child tax credit is more than just a tax break. A child tax credit is fewer hungry children, less parental stress, and an investment in the future of Kansas. In an economy where costs are still top of mind, the time is right for Kansas lawmakers to prioritize children and adopt a state CTC. And I will now stand for any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee, any questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thanks.
There's proponent written testimony. I'll draw your attention to it. No opponents, and written testimony also neutral. Is there anybody that would like to testify as a proponent? As an opponent? Neutral. Seeing none, we'll close the hearing on Senate Bill 179. And Eddie, would you mind passing out the information that I had requested? Thank you for the committee. Committee, I will draw your attention to the fiscal note, if you didn't notice. Approximately 53 million. And this is a handout to let you know what already exists and what we have done for childcare and families in Kansas. Eddie, would you mind? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This represents state spending, is not tax provisions, is the first thing I want to note. So this does not include Kansas's household independent care credit, which had a tax expenditure of approximately $6 million prior to last year's amendments to it. It does not include the state's daycare expenditure tax credit for businesses, which typically has a confidential tax expenditure associated with it, but that the state has expanded in some ways in recent years as well. And then the other thing that this does not include is this is the probably would be more aptly labeled child care assistance programs, because this does not include any of the spending within the Department of Health and Environment related to the administration, regulation, and licensure of child care. But in terms of the actual provision and support for child care, this captures that spending, but not the regulation thereof. I just wanted to clarify that with the committee, because you may see, especially as it relates to bills detailing the state regulation and administration of child care services, some different numbers that would capture the spending by KDHE for the actual regulation and licensing of child care facilities.
So if I may, Eddie, I think I am going to ask you to add the others, not necessarily the administration that we spend, well, maybe both, all of it. What would the committee like to see on those numbers? I guess include them all. Yeah.
I can tell you our staff is actually working on that for the House is hearing a bill right now related to child care administration and regulation very broadly. And so our staff's working on that right now. We'll provide it as soon as it's ready.
Wonderful. It's not an urgent deadline, but it would be nice for the committee to have. Senator Shalom.
Thank you. And I just my memory isn't 3 minutes old. 2,200 per child, is that the tax credit is that a deduction you get for your income tax? Remind me what the child credit.
The dependent exemption amount is, I believe, 2320 as of last year's legislation.
And that goes until what age?
It goes as long as the person is able to be claimed as a dependent on the taxpayer's federal return, which is typically up to age 18, but it can be beyond that in certain cases.
Credit referred to in this bill, it goes to age 4, is that right? Or 5?
The bill you just heard goes to 5.
Okay, thank you.
And if you could, Eddie, add the tax exemptions for the child care to the sheet too. That would be great. That would be helpful. Committee, any other questions? And the child care tax credit that was passed last year, it was forced into legislation. Is that on this sheet?
No, that's one of the two tax provisions that I mentioned separately, and I'll include that in those two items in a separate sheet. That we have one that is it's a piggyback off of the federal household independent care exemption that had been approximately a $6 million per year tax expenditure prior to last year's legislation, where I believe we doubled it from 25% to 50% of the federal amount. So that's going to be approximately an additional $6 million. And then we also have a separate tax credit that is for businesses that make certain qualifying expenditures to provide for the child care of their employees. That is one that actually is typically confidential in terms of the fiscal impact, because fewer than 5 taxpayers avail themselves of it.
And if I could, I know I'm going to muddy the water a little bit, but Commerce has been handing out grant money also for daycares and childcare Could we, that's not included on here?
Does not look like that is. I will follow up with our fiscal analyst to prepare this to incorporate commerce information as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And I appreciate all your work on this. I know research works really hard to pull these numbers together, so thank you. Senator Clamp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to make sure I'm reading the document correctly, if I look at 2026 for agency DCF with the Child Care Assistance Program, we have 113 million. And then we also have to the right in the blue column through the State General Fund, 14.5 million. Is the 14.5 million in the 113?
Yes, it is. The 113.2 is the all funds amount. And so the balance of that would be, what, 99.7? Am I doing that math? Yeah. That it comes from funding sources other than the State General Fund.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. I just wanted the committee to have a good overlook of what we've been doing, what we are doing before we discuss anything further. Senator Schallenberger.
I hate to be a pain, but information that might be useful is how many children in poverty do we have in Kansas under the age of 5, if that's what this bill is.
Thank you.
that number.
This doesn't, I don't think this is Harvard. Well,
No, I don't think it is either.
This is all
The
children.
bill is for,
It's graduated
oh,
scale.
it is for all children. Okay, so
Yeah.
maybe how many children do we have? What are we dealing with here?
Eddie, do you mind?
Thank you.
I don't think I have that immediately in front of me. I'm trying to see if an estimate of that is included in the fiscal note. I don't see it instantaneously. I'm sure we can get that in relatively short order.
Thank you.
Actually, the fiscal note may provide an indication. It indicates a number of credits. I don't know if that's the number of taxpayers or the number of children, but it says 187.5 thousand.
It is. Revenue is confirming that is the estimate on the number of children. Yeah.
Yeah, that's our estimated number of children that would qualify.
Okay. Thank you. And also the refundable portion, how much of that is the fiscal note on here, the refundable? There's probably no way to know that, would there? Okay. So that means that the taxpayer could actually get back more than they paid in income tax. Eddie, do you mind?
Yeah, that is what that would mean, which obviously, since it's on a graduated scale, that's going to be a lot more common on the kind of lower end of that scale. But it's also going to depend substantially on the number of children the taxpayer has.
Thank you, committee. Any other questions on this? Senator Ware.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And it's not so specific to this bill, but I think it would be really good information for us to have overall to know what the senator was asking. How many children do we have that live in poverty? And then whatever label we put on the next chunk of income above that, because even that's pretty low. How many kids are we talking about? How many Kansas kids?
So can you define poverty, or do you want them to define?
Well, the
it?
federal definition, I
Okay,
suppose.
okay.
Yeah, the Census Bureau annually estimates the number of children in poverty below various age thresholds, and so I'll check on that information, track it down for the committee.
Okay, committee, I am going to turn your attention to Senate Bill 269. We do have a few minutes. I'm going to take advantage of it. Amelia, do you mind giving us an overview?
Madam Chair, Senate Bill number 269 relates to the State Board of Tax Appeals and would prohibit a filing fee when a previous appeal remains pending before the board. As you recall, this would amend some language relating to their filing fee statute, such that if a taxpayer has a previous appeal that's still pending before the board, it hasn't been decided whether they're waiting for their hearing date to arrive or waiting for a decision, that if they file another appeal for the next tax year, no filing fee would be due.
Committee, any questions? Seeing none, what are your wishes on the bill? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Seeing no questions, discussion, I would move that the Senate Assessment and Taxation Committee pass out favorably Senate Bill 269, and since it's apparently non-controversial, place it on the consent calendar.
It's been moved by Senator Peck, seconded by Senator Klemp. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Committee, we don't have time today, but I will plan to pick up Senate Bill 73. I have talked to county treasurers, county clerks, several different groups, and we will have a few amendments on that to tweak the bill, but I think it's going to be a really good piece of legislation for us going forward. It's the one where the dates, the property tax statements are due to mail on December 15th, and they're due to be paid on December 20th. So I think we are going to be able to move that date to December 1st and do a few other things in the bill. And I also want to bring your attention, so you'll be prepared, we are going to work Senate Bill 215 also. I know we're waiting on information on that. I don't want to move until we do have some data, but hopefully we'll have it this week. That is the property tax freeze for seniors and disabled veterans. So, and we probably will look at the parameters on the other programs too, the Safe Senior and all them. I don't think we can move as much as we'd like to. It'd blow up the fiscal note, but we can clear up some of those definitions so that those programs are easier to use. Committee, any other business to be brought before us? Seeing none, we do have a full week. We'll mainly be focusing on income tax and then property tax towards the end of the week. So committee, we're adjourned. Thank you for your work.